Welcome, everybody. We're in the same strange situation of the five of us, or the four of us, sitting here in a Zoom room and knowing that we're being watched on YouTube, but we'll do our best to connect to you. We've come together to discuss the 30th birthday of the Visegrád group, founded back in 1991. We want to look a little bit back and see what progress has been made, what holds this group together, and look forward at what the challenges and contributions are that the group can make in the future. Founded back in 1991 to drive forward regional cooperation, embed democracy in the region, and reunite Central Europe with the rest of Europe. Some people would say mission accomplished, some people would say mission failed. So that's what we've come to discuss. We've given ourselves 1 hour to discuss these topics. I'm going to try to break up our discussion into 3 or 4 rounds. What we've done in order to have some kind of participation is open up a Slido possibility. So if you go to sli.do, you can ask questions there if you put the hashtag Visegrád in, and I will keep an eye on any questions that pop up there. And before starting, I'll just very briefly introduce who we have in the room to talk on the subject. I'll start with you, Richard, because you're our host. Richard Grieveson is the Deputy Director of the Vienna Institute for International Economic Studies. And before that, worked for Fitch Ratings and for the Economist Intelligence Unit, so very much an economics background, and I'll probe you on that side of things. Eszter up next, Eszter Zalan, a long-standing journalist, starting out at a Hungarian daily, then working as the Hungarian correspondent for AFP and now at EUobserver. And finally, my colleague Milan, based in Berlin at DGAP, as you can see from his background. Before that with the think tank Globsec, and before that as a policy advisor to the Deputy Foreign Minister of Slovakia. So welcome and thank you for joining us. I wanted to kick off.
You forgot, Roderick, to introduce yourself.
Oh, I'm Roderick Parks. I'm Milan's colleague. That's how I'm known. Richard, I'm going to kick off with you. I want the first round to be on this sort of economic question, because when we were discussing this panel ahead of time, you were very keen to promote the V4 as a sort of economic success story. So I'd like you to tell us more about that, but in particular, I'd like you to focus on the idea that the four have some sort of recipe for success. So tell us what that recipe is and whether it's still a recipe for success going forward.
Yes, thanks, Roderick. So hello, everybody from my side as well. I think this is really an important question because I think there are two ways really to tell the economic story of this region. If we go, right back over the 30 years or looking at it today, and these stories are both told a lot. So one is that this is a success. From the perspective of Central and Eastern Europe as a whole, these countries are fairly wealthy. They have pretty sophisticated industry, manufacturing sectors. They have a high level of integration with Germany, and these 3 decades have been peaceful. So from the perspective of the rest of Central and Eastern Europe, this is a success story in economic terms. The second story, though, that's told is one of frustration. That this convergence has not gone far enough, that it relies on an imbalanced model, which may have delivered in the past, but is not delivering as much now and will not deliver as much in the future. And also that there's a sense of loss, basically, to the West, whether that be large foreign ownership in the economy and profits going back to the West, or a lot of younger, especially educated people moving out of the region to the West. And I think both of these stories have elements of truth in them. They're both part of the overall picture that I would paint. But I think in the way that it maps out across to the politics, the second story is important, I think, in the domestic political discourse. And that's not just about Viktor Orban. I think in the Czech Republic, that's also part of the discourse. what they really have in common is, yes, this relative economic success, I think, but especially for the three smaller countries, a very particular way that they've developed, a very particular model, as I said, with manufacturing, especially the car industry, very export reliant, pretty much 100% of GDP in the three smaller Visegrád countries exports, and the integration with Germany. So a lot of those exports going to Germany. And then a relative lack in that model of other things, of domestic demand, but also of headquarters services, research and development, the other parts of the value chain. And that, I think, is where this point comes that, okay, maybe this model delivered a lot in the past, and I think it did, but it may not deliver as much in the future. There are, final point for the opening round, there are, I think, though, differences here within the Visegrád countries, and colleagues may talk more from the political side, but I think also in economic terms, there are important differences, and they've maybe become more apparent actually in the last decade. One is just a difference in industrial structure between the three smaller Visegrád countries and Poland. Poland is a fundamentally different kind of economy. It's bigger, obviously, domestic demand plays a much bigger role, and maybe it's not so exposed to this potential trap and potential over-specialization, which might affect growth performance in the future. The second thing is EU integration. Very obvious example of that is that Slovakia is a member of the euro and the other three are not, and don't look like they're going to be anytime soon. I think that obviously has political implications as well. And the final one is the relationship with Brussels in an economic sense as well as a broader sense. And I think that, yes, there are frustrations with the EU and with Brussels in the Czech Republic and Slovakia, but they're expressed in a very different way. And the willingness to go into open confrontation in those two countries is very different to Hungary and Poland. So I think there's a lot in common, but I do think, especially since the financial crisis, we do see these quite important differences among the Visegrád countries as well.
I'm about to pass over to Eszter, but I do kind of want to follow up on that. How much is this a question of just being in the right place at the right time, i.e. next to Germany, and how much will that difference make going forward Slovakia's political and financial integration with the Eurozone compared to the other three? Is that an advantage, or does it expose it to risks that the other three don't feel?
I mean, I think, so on the first point, I think that, yeah, I mean, you can make the argument that the defining feature of economic geography in Europe since the Second World War basically has been proximity to Germany and West Germany. And obviously that's an advantage for the Visegrád countries. I think that can explain part of their success, but there are other countries which have achieved a comparable level of economic convergence, like Slovenia, for example, or Estonia, which don't have the same proximity to Germany. So I think that can explain some of the success, but it probably also explains a lot of why they developed in the way they did, why they've developed this particular specialization in manufacturing in the automotive sector, which is very different to Estonia, for example. So I think there the proximity to Germany probably played a very big role. I think in terms of Euro accession, I think it definitely matters politically. I think economically, I'm not actually so sure that it matters that much, really, whether the Czech Republic is a member of the euro or not. I mean, the extent of integration with Germany is so high, and these cross-border supply chains are so complex, and goods will move back and forth between Czech Republic several times before they're finished. The role of currencies in general is, I think, overplayed. I think it's probably not that important, and we see that maybe at times the Czech Republic or Poland, Hungary can achieve a little competitiveness gain via devaluation with the euro, but ultimately the currencies don't diverge too much from the euro anyway. So my sense is it's not that important really in economic terms.
Okay, thank you. Look, so I'm going to throw the obvious political question at you that Richard has touched on. Why has economic success not translated into sort of rewards for mainstream political parties? And I'm looking at Slido, and we've got a question on the continued gap in wages between the CE and Western states. I'm thinking as well a little bit of things that Richard himself has brought up, that these countries have hit a little bit of a sort of demographic crisis, but they nevertheless somehow remain competitive. So people are being squeezed a bit. And you've got the heavy reliance on production, exports, and FDI. So I'm wondering, how do we bring together the economic success and the sort of political crisis, if you like.
Yes, I think the key to that is what Richard said in the sort of the second scenario or second type of reading of the economic success. I found a data from 2016 that said that workers' wages and benefits in the Visegrád countries were 50% of those in the Eurozone. So there is a significant gap that, you know, feeds into the otherwise perhaps also culturally present feeling that that the Visegrád countries or Eastern Europeans are second-class citizens in the EU, and that there is a sense of loss of national control because many of the GDP growth, it then goes back to the owners of the capitals, basically who are foreigners. So I think those two senses were very much they played a big role in how parties like Fidesz in Hungary and Law and Justice managed to exploit that and got support. So I think that's key to understand in why these parties could be successful, and that this economic success did not necessarily translate to support for mainstream politics, but rather than an EU skeptic policy, despite the fact that the membership, of course, in the EU is supported by the majority of these populations. I think that also resonates, by the way, in how these countries often argue when it comes to EU funding. You know, EU funding is, of course, a key aspect in these countries. They are the highest beneficiaries. But often the political argument is that, well, you know, some of these funds actually go back to Western European companies, Western European countries, because of the investments. Yes, the demographic issue is a major issue. I mean, we can see that it does affect wages in the sense that wages have gone up, at least from what I can tell in Hungary, because there is a squeeze and a labor shortage. But it's also just, I think, impacts, you know, a lot of people on a personal level with Skype grandparents and all that. And I think it does have a massive impact in how these societies can move forward. And I think one key challenge also, besides the demographics, is just like how Richard said, is how these economies can move into, you know, the next phase with the Green Deal and climate, you know, greening their economies, and how will that happen with this sort of low-end manufacturing focused economies? I think that will be a key challenge besides the demographics in the next years.
Thank you. Milan, to come to you, the question I wanted to throw at you was what connects these countries, and I mean that actually in a sort of physical sense. How much are they linked by infrastructure, by motorways, by energy links? Because when I was based in Poland, it was very much the sense that we don't understand one another, and when we go on school trips, it's not to the other countries, it's to Germany, and we're linked east and west. We're not linked to each other. Does that remain the case?
Yes, it does, but it's a mixed baggage. What, partly to answer also what Richard said, is what is not well seen or understood is that before these countries entered the European Union in 2004, they also had something called CEFTA, so an economic trading zone, from the 90s, which allowed them to increase the regional trade. So there is much more that connects them, maybe not in physical infrastructure. You still don't have a highway between Prague and Vienna, or between Budapest and Warsaw, for all that political proximity are not connected by a highway. But you have a lot of regional trade, a lot of also regional cultural projects. This is where Visegrád, International Visegrád Fund played a role. So there are two main deliverables of this Visegrád group. One is on the EU level, you know, voting together or having a prime minister's meeting before European Council. That's what the European media see. in Brussels, but what they don't see is what's going on inside the region, this regional interconnectedness, which was really accelerated by this whole group. And this was one of the initial ideas, one of the sort of goals of this group when it was created in 1991. And if you allow me, I will also go back to history. So in addition to geography, economic features of this country as a proximity to Germany, therefore auto industry, big challenge now with the electric cars. This is what Eszter said, is a huge challenge now. What will happen to this manufacturing and auto industry, as auto industry itself will have to change? Or coal, the whole legacy of coal in Poland, what will happen with green transition there? But what we sometimes forget is that this region, and at least the V3 minus most of Poland, they were part of economic blocks before, like a Habsburg monarchy before the World War I, then Comecon under the communist bloc, and even later through CEFTA. So they were able to connect better before they entered the single market, and a common denominator of all this. And I think something which also sort of plays the currency question and the Eurozone membership question to the background is the single market. As long as the EU single market will work, this is where a large part of their export goes. Then the being in the, and if there are no big gaps between the Eurozone and the non-Eurozone, then I think Hungary, Poland, Czech Republic are comfortable, sitting in a comfortable place. They will not join the Eurozone anytime soon because it's politically not viable. And Slovakia did join because there was the window of opportunity to do it still before the global crisis hit. And the big change of political discourse in this region, to me, was the global financial crisis. Although there was economic slowdown, you might argue that Poland didn't have recession. In these countries, they bounced back economically, but political discourse, political atmosphere has changed. What was more prominent was resentment against rapid modernization, globalization, and also differences between regions, and successful urban towns and countryside were just more pronounced. And in the period of populism everywhere around the world, and in the period of Trump and Brexit, of course, you had successful politicians that used to be mainstream that tapped into this resentment, which is the story of Viktor Orban, also partly PiS in Poland, and the implosion of mainstream in Czech Republic, which opened doors to Andrej Babiš, or in Slovakia, where Robert Fico tried to balance both, Orban way and partly mainstream way.
Thanks, Milan. You've set up my next round of questions nicely, and I'm going to undo your good work by throwing in an extra little question to Richard to wrap up this panel. But on Slido, we've got the question twice now about sort of practical ways to overcome the wage disparity. With your economics hat on, what can be done to improve wages in CE and without damaging the economy?
Yeah, I think this is a very important part of the story, because this helps to explain part of this discrepancy between seemingly pretty good headline economic numbers and this underlying frustration. And what we see, if we look at wage convergence with Germany, it hasn't developed in the same way as overall GDP convergence. So wages haven't kept up with the overall development of the economy, and that is obviously something that people see and feel in their lives. The demographic story, which you mentioned, was a huge challenge, has actually contributed quite positively to this in the last few years. So we've seen really, as much as data that we have, fairly extreme labor shortages in the Visegrád countries in the last 5 years or so. And this has really, increased the bargaining power of labor and really pushed up wages. And we've seen even, fairly like open confrontations between unions and some of the German car makers and demands for higher wages. And, these firms in the Visegrád countries are extremely productive, very much comparable with what's going on in Germany, but the wages are not at all. And we've seen in the last 5 years or so that gap start to close. Obviously, the gap is still huge. I mean, I think that part of the answer to this is probably, I mean, you have to look across the whole economy. I think there are big differences between the kind of wages that can be and to an extent are paid by German car makers in Hungary or Slovakia, and what can be earned in the rest of the economy. And I think that is now a very interesting development to watch in the next few years, is because we see these big productivity gains, we see this big automation in the manufacturing sector, but much less in the rest of the economy. And it's that kind of thing which I think now has to happen to drive the next phase of convergence. I think the other thing which can really help is to touch on what I mentioned briefly at the start, is to expand the specialization of the Visegrád countries beyond just production, beyond just making things, much more into headquarters, into research and development, logistics, marketing, all these other functions which tend to be higher value, basically tend to be higher wage jobs. And there simply isn't enough of that at the moment in the Visegrád countries, certainly compared to somewhere like Germany. And that, I think, that is the next stage of development. That's, and it's not easy. It's very much not easy, but that, I think, is really the key to achieving really sustainably and significantly higher living standards and wages than is currently the case.
May I add two things to this?
If you're very quick.
Okay, one, the social policy of this government is still designed from a different era where they had to support employment. So you can have huge benefits if you're an investor, if you open up a factory, because it was designed this way, rather than support more innovative jobs. And second, it's interesting to look at the strikes, recent strikes in German auto factories, and the role of German trade unions, IG Metall, in the strike in Gerd that stopped the whole supply chain to Audi, and Audi factory in Ingolstadt, I think two years ago, had to stop. It's now also comparing the social benefits in Volkswagen factories, Volkswagen Group factories in Germany, through German trade unions to Slovakia or Hungary, where the German trade unions are supporting their peers there to demand high wages to their level. Was that quick enough?
It was quick enough. My computer then went on mute for some helpful reason. So there we are, modern living. Eszter, you're owed all sorts of speaking time because of these men with their verbal diarrhea. But I do want to move on to the sort of the next batch of questions, which is to think about the role of the V4 in the EU. I would just say I've looked at Slido, and two more things have come up on the last topic. One is about nearshoring in the wake of COVID and whether the V4 can benefit from that, and the other is on something that I know you have thought about, Milan, which is the Green New Deal, and whether that offers opportunities for the V4. But I'm going to move on a little bit to the EU question. I guess I want to start actually with Richard again, and then Eszter, you get all sorts of time. But I wanted to start with this sort of economic question, and where Milan left off, that when the financial crisis broke out, the Visegrád 4 on the whole were relatively insulated from that, and felt either there was a bounce back or they actually had this economic recipe that they could promote. And that was the time when I was based in Poland, and it was very much the message we were now going to go from being policy takers to policy makers, and it didn't happen. They were structurally sidelined in Eurozone debates. So I'm wondering, was that your experience as well? How souring an experience was it for the V4 countries in the EU that they had this sort of moment where they thought, we don't need to take lessons from Brussels and Berlin anymore, and they nevertheless failed to have a positive policy influence?
Yeah, I think the financial crisis and its aftermath is really central to this whole story of this discrepancy between apparently quite good economic performance and underlying frustration. I mean, the experience of the crisis itself was very different. Poland famously didn't have a recession at all. The other countries took a pretty big hit, but recovered then quickly. And the last 10 years, their growth rates have been very strong, actually, in the EU context, especially Hungary and Poland, interestingly. But I think the experience was souring, was the word you used. I mean, probably a lot of people here have read the Adam Tooze book, Crashed, and he has a whole chapter on Central and Eastern Europe in the crisis. And I think it was made very, very clear, very early on in the crisis that Central and Eastern European countries, even EU member states, were not necessarily going to be treated the same as Western European countries. I mean, he uses the example in the book of who got the Euro swap lines and who didn't. And Central and Eastern Europe lost out there, basically. And then there was also the role of the IMF, and this when it sort of maps across a bit to what happened in Southern Europe as well. But politics colleagues can probably say more. But the IMF program in Hungary, the 2010 election campaign of Fidesz used that very successfully. I think the resentment about the IMF program after the last crisis. So I think it's really very central to a lot of the things we've seen since has been the financial crisis. The other thing which I think is interesting is how it fits into the broader core periphery debate in the EU and the Euro area, how the Visegrád countries, because they have leapfrogged Southern Europe basically in terms of economic development. Now, certainly Czech Republic is much wealthier than Greece or Portugal now. They have at least partly got out of this sort of core periphery trap, which we tend to think of between, say, Germany and Southern Europe, but it hasn't translated really, as you say, into political influence at all. So it's not necessarily that they're takers in the sense that, they've had to have a lot of special programs and a lot of, EU rules that they don't like and that kind of thing. It's more that they've avoided what Greece has gone through or what Portugal has gone through, or Italy. But in political terms, it doesn't seem to have made that much of a difference, basically.
Right, Esther, I'm sorry, they've dominated, but it's my fault.
That's okay. I'm also more covering rule of law and politics rather than economics. So I would just like to bring in the sort of the political aspect of the Euro crisis, which was really interesting to see. And this comes to the point of how much influence the Visegrád countries have, because the sense was that during the Euro crisis, Merkel really, in a lot of ways, could count on the Central and Eastern Europeans and the Visegrád in it to, be in her corner and pile pressure on Greece or whoever was next to help out. So I think that was quite telling. Also for political reasons, obviously these countries supported the German position, but what also Richard has said, that there was a sense that we have worked really hard for 25 years to get where we are, and these other countries in the southern sphere should do the same. So I think that was quite interesting to see. However, I think when Brussels, or perhaps even in some capitals in the EU, really realized that there is a group called Visegrád, was 2015 with the migration crisis. I mean, that's when people started asking, what is this thing? How does this work in terms of these four countries? And I think the interesting thing since then is that even though in some ways the Visegrád group were formed to have sort of a joint effort in European integration, now they're seen as troublemakers. Basically, it's a toxic term. And even though people here in Brussels can distinguish between Poland and Hungary and the Czech Republic and Slovakia, who seem to be diverging at least on this political rule of law issue, the questions often arise, how is this unanimity going to work in the EU if certain countries, particularly Hungary and Poland, keep blocking policies? I think what's interesting also to look at in terms of influence is there was a recent study that said that in various EU institutions, Central and Eastern European officials or officials from this part of Europe have been continuously overlooked, or at least there's not that many directors, top officials in various EU institutions. That to me raises the question, is this just a work in progress that's hasn't yet completed since 2004, or whether it's a question of how these four countries or other Central and Eastern European countries have approached the EU, maybe not seeing the possibility of influencing from within, lobbying from within, getting information within. But I think that is a problem here for the EU as well, and for these countries as well. There's just one thing I wanted to mention with regards to the Green Deal and green transition. I think where these countries might have been again seen as troublemakers, but I think in the end it added to the whole conversation is the Just Transition Fund, which is came out of Poland and the Czech Republic and others, seeking extra funding to turn their economies around, because it is a big challenge, and I think I agree with Richard and Milan that will certainly have a great influence on whether this economic model can be sustained or not.
I want to pick up on sort of not even 2 points you've made, but 2 sort of allusions that pop into my head when listening to you speak. One is the sense, or the question, I guess, of how much the V4 have been Orbanified, and how much actually Orban would be sort of immensely weakened without the V4 support and isolated. And do we sitting in Berlin or Brussels properly understand that? And the second thing is this question of sort of elites. If elites aren't properly integrated into the EU institutions, does that leave the V4 then very much as a sort of elite-based institution? Because we see the sort of political elites really sort of sewing this group up amongst themselves. So is there some sort of impact there as well?
If I may, on the first question, Viktor Orban is a favorite bashing target, but he shouldn't be blamed for everything. To what Eszter said, the obvious turning point for influence of these 4 countries in Brussels was 2015. And I remember the heyday of Visegrád in Brussels as an influential group between 2011 and 2014. This was right after the Polish and Hungarian presidencies of 2011, when both diplomacies understood better how EU works. There was really a lot of instances and dossiers where they could have an influence. Take an example of the EU deal with which it went to Paris climate talks. This was done between Germany and France, that first want to roll over the Eastern Europeans with their industry and more polluted industry, and they managed to take it constructively. So the compromise of 2014 was a very good one. And this was because the governments and their prime ministers were looking at EU differently. This was also why then the V4, when the top jobs were distributed in 2014, managed to get one of the 3 top positions for Donald Tusk. Donald Tusk was a candidate for all V4. And what really changed was the summer of 2015 migration crisis, and then elections in Poland in October 2015 with the change of government. And then it went south, so to speak. And if you look at the Visegrád agenda is intergovernmental agenda. Mostly it depends on prime minister, with the whole role of prime ministers crowding out others in European policy in the recent years, crowding out their foreign ministers. And the other prime ministers were either less interested in European policy than Viktor Orban, or in case of Poland, they were not the real decision makers. So he dominates because the others are either weaker or not interested. And he could use this format and the whole group for his agenda better than the others.
Yes, I can certainly agree with that, and he definitely uses the Visegrád to project his own influence further. Often sort of referring to the Visegrád, whether or not necessarily it is a core Visegrád policy when he talks about his own policies. But I think the sort of the crack, even though Orban takes the lead often because the others don't, the cracks are becoming more and more visible. I mean, there is this organization that the that Poland and Hungary is pushing for this sort of institution and rule of law. It's called V4 Professors Network, after which I think it was the Slovak Justice Minister who said, don't abuse the brand. So I think that remains to be seen. Like if other prime ministers, other countries can sort of take back the brand from, as you rightly said, from someone who's really ambitious to see how it can be utilized in an EU context.
Yeah, I mean, it begs the question whether the V4 have missed the boat, that window where they could have had a joint constructive influence. And I think of this as recently as Poland's V4 presidency. With the EU is dealing with its budgetary issues, which is a huge issue for the Poles and for their neighbours. For me, that was a huge opportunity missed to have a constructive influence. Do you see more opportunities that we could take that you think there's scope to shift it to a more sort of constructive contribution? Looking at you, Eszter, although you can't see me looking at you, or have we missed the boat on that?
That's a difficult question. I mean, of course, it also depends on policy areas. But I mean, especially, all these things pile up on each other. So there's the migration issue, there is the climate issue, and of course, there was the EU budget rule of law issue last year. It's not a Visegrád thing, but Poland and Hungary were the ones, basically putting the brake on the whole process. It does get mixed up in sort of the notion that this is Visegrád, or again these are the troublemakers, part of the Visegrád group that are again here and stopping whatever integration or EU policy that's important to adopt. So I think the key is what Milan said, is if the others are also looking at the V4 as a vehicle and take more ownership of it, then maybe it can be used. But I mean, there are certainly policy cracks between the four countries, so it would be difficult to see if they can come to a common platform.
I think they missed the boat short term. Because also they are not coming with an agenda that where you would see that they need something else from the 27, from the rest of 27, they would unite, the four would unite around themselves. Hungary has been using V4 under Orban not to be isolated and to hang on closely to the Poles and capture the Polish European policy, if you want. But both Poland and Hungary don't see EU level as part of their vision, how the EU should help them. I mean, the message to Brussels from them is leave us alone to do our own political project at home, don't meddle. And Visegrád has always been about domestic politics to a large extent. It's, as a diplomatic format, is an amplifier of the common agenda that the four could agree. What's happening in Poland now with the media attacks and so on, it's not very promising. There will be more tensions. And what you see in Czech Republic, important elections in October. Maybe this is the end of Andrej Babiš, as there are two opposition coalitions running against him. Then we might have a new dynamics regionally. And in Slovakia, there is ambitions to go alone, solo way, but there is a lot of domestic turmoil under the Matovič government. And President Čaputová is the one who comes up with new topics also on global EU level, but it's not enough. Slovakia is the smallest country. Because it's in the Eurozone, it's always looking at thematic coalitions to join.
Eszter, I'm going to throw a couple of last little questions at you, and Richard, I've got a couple of economics questions that have popped up in Slido. Let me throw these two Slido questions at you, Eszter. One is the simple one that the EU is to blame for the rise of these governments because it didn't pushed back and is now busy accommodating them. The second question here is about the role of cities, which I assume is an allusion to the V4 cities and the mayors. In a way, I find the second one more interesting because I think people are piling onto this as a, as a sort of, something that the EU can do. I wonder from your perspective, how much of an alternative that sort of city alliance represents in the region.
Yes, the first question is, we could talk hours about that, I think, but yes, certainly there's also a question of lack of tools and lack of political will. I mean, of course, Germany is key there. There's been a lot of criticism on Merkel, but you have to see that Merkel is also looking at Brexit, also looking at EU unity. Yes, maybe if the EU could have stopped in 2010, 2011, what was happening in Hungary, we would not be here. I'm not sure if they had the deep understanding of where is it going. It was just also unimaginable that a country would turn 180 degrees to the other way. Yes, I mean, there is blame, but I think that in that sense the boat is also gone. So now the EU has to deal with what it has on its hands. The cities are very interesting, and it sort of comes to the point of what Milan said about Slovakia going its own way, because it also raises the question, okay, but where else to go? I mean, it's sort of, what is the alternative to Visegrád? And I'm not sure if there is that, because maybe Poland, like on Russia, can go to the Baltics and Sweden and have their platform there. But for Slovakia, it would be very difficult to, what sort of alliance within the EU would be feasible. That's very difficult to say. But the cities, I think it's a very interesting initiative, and it's I'm not sure that policy-wise it can have that much of an influence, although they have lobbied hard to get direct funding from the recovery fund, and some of it might actually work. I think it's more like it's to come back to the branding issue, is to show that there is an alternative to these governments, to the EU policies that these governments, particularly Poland and Hungary, are following. So I think that's important as a signal to the EU, to the other capitals, but on a practical level, I'm not sure if it's going to yield to a lot of results.
I mean, very little follow-up. From my ignorant perspective, it seems to risk playing into a narrative of elites versus the people, urban populations versus the rest. Is there a danger there or not?
To be honest, I don't see a danger there, because they do, at least for Hungary, I think they do represent also a sort of a wider opposition, not only in cities or in the capital.
Richard, I'm going to throw the last couple of economic questions at you, because they have been popping up in Slido. There was a question on, and I think this feeds into the message about elites that we've been getting from the panel. There's a question about how to attract headquarters to the region. So what can be done there, and whether you think that would help. And the second theme that has come up in 2 or 3 questions is about decarbonisation, Green Deal, and the car industry, which Eszter and Milan have also mentioned. So whether there's an opportunity there for the V4 to lead, because they're starting from a lower base. So quickly, these 2 questions, and then we'll move on to the next sort of round.
Okay, yeah, both good questions. I think in terms of headquarters, it's not that easy. Of course, you cannot pursue like a real sort of state-led industrial policy within the EU. You don't have all the options that countries would have had in the past. But I think there's still plenty that can be done. I think with it, not in the old-fashioned sense, but there are industrial policy tools available to governments, and I think that's the road to go down. We have a study out next month on that, actually. So we can follow up. We can follow up then. I think the green transition is very interesting. I mean, the economy, these economies, especially especially the three smaller ones, are so plugged into the German auto sector. They will rise and fall in the future, as they have in the past, with the fortunes of the German automotive sector. So then the question is, how prepared is the German automotive sector for the whole green transition? Milan and I did a paper together last year, partly on this. They're extremely exposed to that. Of course, there's potential. There's huge potential in terms of access to EU funds for the green transition, so just transition fund. There's also undoubtedly huge potential for the private sector because of the low starting point. But that is very speculative at this stage. I think it's very much an open question. I'm not sure it's going to be a great game changer for the region.
I'm going to stick with you, Richard. I wanted to move on to the sort of perspective of international relations and geopolitics and so on, and how the V4 fits in a sort of broader shift on that level. And a couple of the questions that I've got are specifically on the relationship between the V4 and Austria. And so it's, a smaller local place to start, but it is an interesting relationship. And the question here says that in the first Kurz administration, there was interest from Austria in closer cooperation in V4. I remember the V4 always pushing the Austrians aside, but I think as well during the migration crisis that the Austrians sort of came back with their Central European Defence Cooperation and sort of said, anything you can do, we can do better. So I wonder where we are now with the relationship between Austria and the V4.
My sense is that in the Kurz era, this relationship has been pretty good. I mean, Eszter and Milan can certainly say more on what's really going on in the politics, but looking at it from my perspective, from a political economy perspective, I think the relationship is good. I think from an Austrian perspective, I think they quite like this, this historical sense that the Austrians have of being a kind of bridge builder, of being, between East and West. I think it fits into that quite nicely. And I think, I talked about economic structures before and how that sort of reinforces some common incentives. Austria fits completely into that. Austria is as much of we call it the Central European Manufacturing Core. It's really the German manufacturing core. Austria is much a part of that as the Visegrád countries are. Of course, at a higher level of development with more of the headquarter services, for example, but a lot of the economic incentives, and that includes the big change in the automotive industry, that includes what changes in global trade patterns, supply chain shocks, global trade tensions, all of this, it matters a great deal to Austria in basically the same ways that it matters to the Visegrád countries. So I think actually there's plenty of mileage in this relationship. That would be my sense. One question, this is probably again more for Eszter and Milan, is how much it relies on particular personalities, how much it's really a constellation of current leaders who maybe see eye to eye on certain things, and whether it's really a moment in history, or whether it's something more durable. I'm not sure.
Okay, Milan, I'll comment on that, and let's let Eszter go first, and then you can come in.
Just on this last point, I think it's very much, or in a lot of ways, personality based, because within Kurz's party, there is a dislike for Fidesz and for Orban, particularly, for example. So I think there is. That also it's sort of based on how perhaps Kurz and Orban see eye to eye on migration. So I would be interested to see how that evolves. Also, I think that I can sense that there is a sort of maybe difference in enthusiasm since the change of coalition partners in Austria, since the Greens have come on board. There's the enthusiasm for the Visegrád and Central European countries, at least on a political level, has seemed to have dampened a little bit. But nevertheless, especially I would say around the migration crisis, there was sort of a bonding for sure.
Yeah, I would say it's a much more complex, deeper than that, and complicated from Austrian side, because look, the Austrian banks are the most integrated part of Austria with their neighbors and with all, except Poland, with Visegrád countries. And Austrian foreign policy or diplomacy is way behind that. So yes, Kurz as chancellor started with the visit to Berlin, where he said, "I would be your bridge, Germany, to Visegrád countries." But if you look at it, Austria doesn't know well the Visegrád group or the Visegrád countries, the region there. Sometimes I tease my friends, Richard, on the foreign policy side, show me one Austrian expert on the Visegrád group who would understand what's going on regionally. So Austria has ignored the region for a long time. It rather looked west. Then there was an initiative, so-called Slavkov-Austerlitz Troika, which was a Czech idea to improve their complicated bilateral relationship with Austria in a multilateral way with Slovaks. It didn't fly long. It was also 3 social democratic prime ministers at that time. Then Emmanuel Macron as president used it for his intro visit to the region, where he met the 3 because they were the ones who were willing to constructively discuss his change to posted workers compromise, unlike Poland or Hungary. But you don't have any other Austrian initiatives. Austrians were always lagging behind. They were initiatives from outside. Others are more interested to work with them than the other way around. And Kurz wanted to change it, but yes, I don't see it happening now.
Okay. I won't ask the question, but it has come up in Slido, and I think it's sort of aimed at you, Richard. Whether you acknowledge that Vienna has benefited from these sort of low wage areas around it, but I won't press you on that. I wanted to move on from Austria a bit, and Milan, you mentioned Macron. That's always an interesting relationship between the French and Central Europe. Sitting in Berlin, I think we can see that over the next year, from the German elections up to the French elections in 2022, that Germany is going to be trying to reach out and support Macron. What does that mean for the region, particularly Macron-style brinksmanship and readiness to exclude Central Europe from initiatives? What dangers do you see coming up over the next year, and do you read it in the same way that I do, that Germany might be less ready to sort of make the effort to include Central Europe?
Shall I go first? Okay, I think the big factor in this is the end of Angela Merkel era. She was the one who always tried to engage the Central Eastern Europeans. Second thing is structural. Southern Europeans are much more politically aligned with the Western Europe political agenda now, with Green Deal and other things. And Macron, I mean, he's tapping into the Baltic countries or Central Europeans when it benefits him, like the recent trip to the Baltic countries, or Slovak Prime Minister was there recently. Even Viktor Orban had a very productive talk with him some time ago. They are on nuclear energy, on some other areas. They can work together, but indeed it's about whether Berlin and Paris will move forward and will shape the EU agenda in a way which will not be interested or in favor to Central Eastern Europeans. And then I see more internal diversification among them, because you can have a constellation where the Eurozone sort of goes ahead, and then the smaller Eurozone countries in Central Eastern Europe, beyond Visegrád, actually there are Baltic countries. If you look for other small groupings that are more influential in Brussels, it's the Baltic countries, and Slovakia and Slovenia, they can group together. But it very much depends, I think, what happens in the region this year politically. So more than German elections or French elections, French presidential elections, I think they are Czech and Hungarian parliamentary elections later this year and next year that will have an impact on the agenda of Visegrád.
Eszter, I'm going to ask you to kind of pull this together, but I also want to throw a very big question at you, since we're dealing with the sort of geopolitics, because China has been popping up in the questions as well. What what happens with the shift of global opportunities, but also global risks eastwards? How does the relationship between the EU and China play out for Visegrád? And I'm thinking in the wake of sort of two recent events. One is the China investment deal that was slightly sewn up by France and Germany over the heads of other member states. And then the recent 17+1 conference hosted by Poland, and the slightly mixed signals from the region of the amount of engagement on their part with the relationship with China. So sew it all together, if you would, in 2 minutes.
Okay, well, just one thought on where French and German election would leave the Visegrád. I think in terms of the EU, there would be definitely, I think, a move towards some sort of multi-speed or some sort of structural changes that would create different dynamics between different groups, meaning that the discussion is very much around how this unanimity can be overcome here in Brussels within the EU. And I think once we have the elections, especially in Germany, I think that's key that Merkel is going to leave, and she has the sensibility towards Eastern Europe herself, coming from the eastern part of Germany. That will be gone. So any sort of sensibility, that sort of deep sensibility towards the region will be missing as well. So a move towards different shifts, different speeds in Europe, I think is very much what we can see. In terms of China, yes, there was I think the investment deal can create opportunities for the companies of this region as well. I think, we can see what I can see is really what's been happening in Hungary, and how Hungary has been very, very interested in opening up towards China. There is the Belgrade-Budapest railway that is partly financed by them. I think it really depends on the governments. Obviously, from China, there is an interest, a push. Whether different governments are open to that, I think there are more calculations in terms of where they see Europe's future, Europe's assertiveness and sort of autonomy in the global stage, and whether they think they would bet on China, which is what I think more the Budapest point of view.
Right, we have 2 minutes left, and I'm going to ask each of you to look to the future. My takeaway from this conversation slightly is, if you didn't have the V4, you'd have to invent it as a format, but for that reason, it means we can't abolish it and start again, which is probably what we need to do. But I would ask all of you in 60 seconds to say how you think the V4 should develop and how you think it will develop. And I just throw in a sort of theme that's appearing on Slido, to do my duty there, that a lot of people are asking about how the COVID pandemic and the government responses are going to affect things. So I'll go in the order we started, literally 60 seconds each. Richard.
Okay, given the time, I'll sort of mix up the positive and normative analysis a bit, if that's okay. I think there are basically three things which I haven't said yet, which I think are quite key to watch. One is, and it links to the politics in the EU, what happens with fiscal policy at the EU level? I mean, the small state, lack of government spending is part of the reason for the unbalanced growth model in the Visegrád countries. And the next generation EU is a potential game changer. And I think in general, we have to wait and see, but there is this risk, I think, that it's not used or it's not used properly. And also a concern in the Visegrád countries about a diversion of funds away from them towards Southern Europe. And that's maybe one area where they will really work together. So that's the first thing. The second thing, I think, as long as they have a model which relies so much on wage competitiveness, they're very vulnerable to this, what you mentioned in your questions, the shift of economic power to the east. You know, as long as they don't expand along the value chain, they're vulnerable in that sense. And the third thing on the pandemic, I mean, I think it may well change the economic geography of Europe. You know, the move of such a large part of the economy online may reduce the importance of proximity to Germany, if anything. The opportunities for that in Visegrád, but also I think some risks as well. So that's my brief wrap up.
Thank you. Exemplary. Eszter.
I think for Visegrád in the midterm and how it can influence the EU, how it can act in the EU, the elections in the Czech Republic and Hungary will be key, because that could change the whole dynamic within Visegrád, but also in the region and in the EU context this year and next year. So that will be key. That will be key. In terms of the pandemic, I'm not sure if we see the end of the economic impact yet. Certainly not in Eastern Europe. The recovery fund won't be coming until the second half of the year. So I think vaccination is really the key now, and we haven't talked about that. There is also a sort of Eastern opening there in Hungary towards Russian and Chinese vaccines, but I think that it's just too early to see how it will change the economic prospects of the region.
Wonderful.
Yeah,
Thank you, Milan.
I would like Visegrád more tuned to the original idea of return to Europe and strengthening democracy. I don't think we will get there until Viktor Orban is the dominant figure there. His political life, let's see how he does next year in the elections. But he's been stronger than anybody else actually in the region and Europe. If we move beyond the era of Viktor Orban, he's also, by the way, the most veteran prime minister in the EU Council after Angela Merkel. But after Viktor Orban era, then I think the Visegrád countries and political parties will have to work on more alignment with their Western European peers within the political families, because they are not there. If you look at governing parties, this is the Czech and Slovak story. They are just not influential politically. And finally, the big challenge of post-COVID and climate change for these countries, it's bigger challenge than ever before. And also it's more difficult to move on from 19% catch up convergence to the 100% of EU average than before. So it's going to be more complicated period ahead, where good governance will be the premium. And we didn't mention corruption, but how these countries will organize themselves, how they will deal with this judiciary and good governance / innovation is their challenge. It's a challenge at home where EU can help.
Wonderful. Right, we're 3 minutes over. That's my fault, but thank you very much. You've all been exemplary speakers. Thank you, Richard. Thank you, Eszter. Thank you, Milan, and thank you out there on YouTube for joining us. I guess we finish now, but that's within my power.